The DNA results were in. 99.9% probability they were twins. The moment Sarah held the paper, her world shifted. Truths long buried now stood in the light, demanding to be faced. Welcome, dear readers. Dive into a story that weaves love, betrayal, and the unbreakable bond of family. Through twists and revelations, witness the journey of forgiveness, resilience, and hope. This tale promises to captivate your heart and linger in your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that touch the soul and spark the imagination. The golden light of late afternoon spilled through the windows of the modest house, dancing on the worn hardwood floors. Sarah stood in the kitchen, her hands submerged in soapy water as she washed the last of the dinner dishes. Outside, she could hear the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of neighborhood life, children playing, dogs barking, and the occasional chirp of a bird signaling the approach of dusk. It had been just over a month since Sarah and her 7-year-old son Eden moved into this house. While modest, it felt like a fresh start, a blank canvas for a new chapter in their lives. After years of challenges, Sarah had found solace in simplicity, a quieter life where she could focus on raising her son and rediscovering herself. The slam of the front door startled her from her thoughts. She turned, wiping her hands on a dish towel just as Eden came barreling into the kitchen, his small frame radiating boundless energy. His curly hair was slightly mussed from a day at school, and his cheeks were flushed with excitement. "Mom, you won't believe this!" he exclaimed, his voice high-pitched with urgency. Sarah smiled at his enthusiasm. "What is it, sweetheart? Did something fun happen at school?" Eden dropped his backpack onto the floor and leaned against the counter, his dark eyes sparkling with a mix of excitement and wonder. I met someone today, a boy in my class. His name is Mike, and he looks exactly like me. It's like looking in a mirror." Sarah chuckled softly, humoring his vivid imagination. "That's wonderful, honey. Maybe you've found your twin spirit." Eden's brows furrowed in earnest. "No, Mom, I mean it. He has my eyes, the same nose, and even the same kind of voice. Everyone in class noticed it. We might be twins. Don't you think that's possible?" Sarah knelt down to his level, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Eden, you're my special boy, and there's only one of you. Sometimes people look similar, but that doesn't mean they're related. It's just a coincidence." But Eden wasn't satisfied with her answer. His lips pressed into a pout, and his small hands fidgeted with the hem of his shirt. "I don't think it's just a coincidence, Mom," he muttered, a stubborn determination flashing in his eyes. Sarah ruffled his hair. All right, let's not jump to conclusions. Why don't you invite Mike over for a playdate sometime? I'd love to meet him." Eden grinned at her suggestion, his excitement momentarily placated. He bounded out of the kitchen, already shouting about his plans to invite Mike to the house. Sarah stood there for a moment, the smile lingering on her lips, but a seed of doubt had been planted. What if there was more to Eden's story? That evening, the three of them sat at the small dining table, Sarah, Eden, and her husband, George. The aroma of baked chicken and roasted vegetables filled the room, mingling with the comfortable hum of family conversation. Eden, as usual, was bursting to share his day. "Dad, you'll never guess what happened," Eden began, his voice animated. "I met a boy at school who looks just like me. Mom says it's a coincidence, but I think we might be twins." George's fork froze mid-air. His smile faltered for the briefest moment before he composed himself, his tone even but noticeably strained. That's interesting, Eden, but life isn't like those movies you see. Sometimes people just look alike." "But Dad," Eden insisted, "he has the same eyes as me and the same voice. You'll see when you meet him." George chuckled nervously, brushing off the boy's enthusiasm. "I'm sure he's a nice friend, but you shouldn't let your imagination run wild." Sarah, however, noticed the tension in George's posture, the way he avoided making eye contact. A flicker of unease crept into her chest. Why did he seem so uneasy about a harmless story? She glanced at him curiously but decided not to press the matter. Not yet. The following day, Eden was more determined than ever to prove his point. At school, he and Mike hatched a plan during recess. "We'll stand right next to each other in the class photo," Eden explained confidently. "When my mom sees it, she'll have to believe us." Mike, who shared Eden's dark curls and mischievous grin, nodded eagerly. "Yeah, and then we can figure out if we really are twins." Their teacher arranged the students for the annual photo, and Eden and Mike slipped side by side in the middle row. When the photographers snapped the picture, Eden felt a surge of excitement. Soon, the truth would be undeniable. When Eden came home with the class photo weeks later, Sarah gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth as she stared at the image. There was no denying it. The resemblance between Eden and Mike was uncanny. It was as though the boys were mirror images of one another. A chill ran down her spine. "Mom, see? I told you," Eden exclaimed triumphantly. Sarah nodded, unable to tear her eyes from the photo. "You're right, sweetheart. This is remarkable." She felt a growing unease in her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite place. Who was Mike, and how could the boys look so identical? That evening, Sarah made a decision. She would meet Mike's mother. The next afternoon, Sarah dialed the number Eden had given her. Mike's mother, Clara, answered with a warm but slightly guarded tone. "Hi, this is Sarah, Eden's mom. He's told me so much about your son, Mike. I was wondering if we could meet. There's something I'd like to discuss." Clara hesitated for a moment before agreeing. "Of course. I've been meaning to reach out as well. There's something unusual about the boys' resemblance." They arranged to meet at a local coffee shop. When Clara walked in, Sarah recognized her immediately. A woman in her early 30s with kind eyes, but a weariness about her, as though life had been heavier than it should have been. If you find it interesting, please comment with the number 2. If it's not engaging, press 1 so we can improve the content and make it even better. As they talked, Clara revealed something that made Sarah's heart pound. "Mike is adopted," Clara confessed. "I don't know much about his biological family, but seeing the way he and Eden look alike, it's uncanny." Sarah felt the walls closing in. Her mind raced, questions piling one on top of the other. Could it be possible that Eden and Mike were connected in a way she hadn't imagined? And why had George been so dismissive, so tense? A quiet dread settled over her. There was only one way to find out the truth. As Sarah returned home that evening, her mind churned with possibilities. Eden was her son, of that she was sure. But the photo, Clara's admission, and George's discomfort all pointed to something deeper, something hidden. The answers were out there, and she was determined to uncover them. What she didn't yet know was just how deeply the truth would shake the foundation of her family. The early morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains in the living room, casting soft patterns on the walls. Sarah sat on the couch, the class photo clutched in her hands. She had spent the night turning it over and over in her mind, unable to shake the image of Eden and Mike standing side by side, their identical features striking even in the grainy print. The more she tried to dismiss it as coincidence, the more her thoughts spiraled into doubt. Her husband's tension at the dinner table played on repeat in her head, his forced chuckle and the way he avoided her eyes. Eden bounded down the stairs, his energy undeterred by Sarah's sleepless night. He slid into the kitchen for breakfast, chattering about a math test and playground adventures, but all Sarah could see was the boy in the photo, another child somewhere out there, who mirrored her son so perfectly it felt like a haunting. "Eden," Sarah called as he reached for his backpack. Are you and Mike still planning that play date? Maybe I can pick you both up from school and meet Mike's mom." Eden's face lit up. "Yes! Can Mike come here? I told him about my soccer ball and he said he wants to play." Sarah nodded, though her thoughts were far from soccer balls. "Sure, just let me know after school." That afternoon, Sarah stood outside the school, scanning the growing throng of children pouring out. When Eden emerged, Mike was right beside him. Her breath caught in her throat. It was one thing to see them in a photograph, but standing together in front of her, they looked even more alike. Mike had the same tousled curls, the same mischievous grin, and even the same habit of shifting his weight when he was excited. The resemblance was uncanny, almost unnerving. "Hi, Mike," Sarah greeted, her voice steady despite the strange unease coiling in her chest. "Hi, Mrs. Johnson," Mike replied, his cheerful tone mirroring Eden's. Clara arrived shortly after, her smile polite but guarded. Sarah had spoken to her just the day before, but seeing her now, she noted the nervous energy Clara exuded. They exchanged pleasantries as the boys climbed into the car, their laughter filling the space like the sound of bells. Clara lingered. "They're like two peas in a pod," Clara said softly, her words heavy with unspoken meaning. "They really are," Sarah replied. "I think we should talk again soon. There's something—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Something strange here." Clara nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. I'll call you." That evening at dinner, Eden couldn't contain his excitement. Between bites of spaghetti, he regaled George with stories of his day with Mike. Every sentence seemed to circle back to their uncanny similarities. "Dad, Mike and I even like the same candy. Isn't that crazy? Mom says it's a coincidence, but I think we're really twins." George stiffened, his fork clattering against his plate. "Eden, we've talked about this," he said, his voice sharper than usual. "Sometimes people just look alike. It doesn't mean anything." Eden frowned, his enthusiasm dimmed by his father's dismissive tone. "But that's enough, Eden," George interrupted, his voice final. Sarah glanced at her husband, her unease deepening, the tension in his jaw, the rigid set of his shoulders. He was holding something back. Later, when Eden was asleep, she confronted him. "George," she began, crossing her arms as she stood in the doorway of their bedroom. "Why are you so bothered by Eden's new friend?" "I'm not bothered," he replied too quickly, not meeting her gaze. "You're lying," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "I can tell. You've been tense ever since Eden mentioned Mike. If there's something I need to know, you need to tell me now." George sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're overthinking this, Sarah. Kids have imaginations. Let it go." But Sarah couldn't let it go. The gnawing feeling in her gut wouldn't allow her to. That night, as George slept beside her, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering what he was hiding. The following week, the class photos were distributed. Eden raced home with the glossy print, eagerly shoving it in Sarah's hands. She studied it again, her doubts now cemented into something sharper, something undeniable. The next morning, she called Clara and suggested they meet. This time, Clara invited her to their home. When Sarah arrived, the small house was warm and inviting, but there was a palpable tension in the air. Clara led her to the living room, offering coffee as they sat opposite each other. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sarah began, her voice hesitant, "about Mike being adopted. Can you tell me more about his background?" Clara's expression softened, but her words carried a weight. "I don't know much," she admitted. "I adopted him when he was a baby. The agency said his biological parents couldn't care for him, but they didn't give me any more details." Sarah's heart ached, for Mike, for Clara, and for the questions that seemed to multiply with every new piece of information. Do you think it's possible that Eden and Mike, that they're related? Clara sighed, her gaze distant. I've wondered, but how would we even know? A thought struck Sarah like a bolt of lightning. DNA testing, she said. It's the only way to be sure. Clara hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with her coffee mug. Do you really think it's necessary? I don't know what to think, Sarah admitted, but I need answers. For Eden, for both of them. Clara nodded slowly. All right, let's do it. Unbeknownst to Sarah, George had been watching her closely. When he noticed her growing obsession with Mike and her meetings with Clara, he grew increasingly agitated. One evening while Sarah was at Clara's, George drove to the adoption agency. He slipped into the office, his face set with grim determination. I need information about a boy named Mike, he demanded, his tone low but firm. The woman behind the desk looked up, startled. I'm sorry, sir, we can't share that kind of information. George leaned closer, lowering his voice. I'll make it worth your while. A thick envelope changed hands, and the woman nodded reluctantly. Give me a moment. Meanwhile, Sarah and Clara were making their own efforts to uncover the truth. They contacted the adoption agency, only to be met with vague responses and bureaucratic roadblocks. Frustration mounted as every attempt seemed to hit a dead end. I don't understand, Sarah fumed one evening. Why are they being so uncooperative? Clara shook her head, her own frustration mirrored in her furrowed brow. It's like they're hiding something. Eden and Mike, oblivious to the adults' growing tension, continued their plan to prove their bond. At school, they stuck together, comparing every detail, birthmarks, habits, even their handwriting. The more they found in common, the more determined they became. One day they came home with another plan. Mom, Eden announced, his face serious, we're doing a science project about DNA. Can we get those kits that tell you about your family? Sarah blinked, caught off guard by his boldness. Why do you need that for school? Eden grinned. Because it'll be fun, and Mike and I can do it together. Sarah exchanged a glance with Clara, who had come over to pick up Mike. I think it's time, Clara said quietly. The kits arrived a week later, and the boys couldn't contain their excitement. They followed the instructions, spitting into the small vials and sealing them carefully. Sarah sent the samples off, her heart heavy with anticipation. For days, the house seemed to hum with unspoken tension. George watched her warily, his attempts to steer conversations away from Mike growing increasingly transparent. Sarah, for her part, said nothing, but her determination only deepened. When the results finally arrived, Sarah tore open the envelope with trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the report, the words blurring together until she found what she was looking for, a 99.9% probability of a genetic match. Her breath hitched. The boys were twins. There was no longer any doubt. As the reality sank in, Sarah felt a surge of conflicting emotions: relief, joy, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. She turned to George, the envelope in her hand, her voice trembling. I want the truth, she demanded, now. George's face paled, and for the first time he couldn't meet her eyes. The walls of their carefully constructed life were beginning to crumble, and Sarah braced herself for what was to come. The room felt impossibly small as Sarah's words hung in the air, charged with the weight of accusation and demand. George stood motionless by the fireplace, his back turned to her. His hands gripped the mantel so tightly that his knuckles blanched. Sarah's voice cut through the tense silence again, firm but trembling with emotion. George, she repeated, holding up the DNA results, her hand quivering. Eden and Mike are twins. I need to know why. how this happened. No more lies. George exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping, as though the weight of the truth he had buried for years was finally pressing him to the ground. Slowly, he turned to face her, his face a mosaic of guilt, sorrow, and fear. For a long moment he looked at her, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. "Say something," Sarah urged, her voice breaking. She took a step closer, the paper trembling in her grasp. "You knew, didn't you? You've known all along." George finally found his voice, though it was rough and barely audible. "Yes," he admitted. "I knew." The room seemed to tilt under Sarah's feet. She staggered back, the truth crashing over her like a tidal wave. "You knew? You knew Eden had a twin and you said nothing? How could you do this to him? To me?" George took a halting step toward her, his expression pleading. "I never wanted to hurt you, Sarah. Please, you have to understand. I was trying to protect you, to protect us." Sarah's eyes blazed with fury and anguish. "Protect me from what? The truth? From my own child? Tell me, George, because I don't understand any of this." George rubbed his hands over his face, as though trying to scrub away years of guilt and regret. When he spoke, his voice was low and filled with despair. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. We lost our baby, Sarah. Our son was stillborn." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Her knees buckled and she sank onto the couch, clutching the armrest for support. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice thin and brittle. George crouched in front of her, his hands reaching for hers, but she pulled away. His shoulders sagged, and he pressed on, his words tumbling out in a torrent. "You were so devastated, Sarah. After the stillbirth, you were inconsolable. I didn't know how to help you, and then I saw Eden. I was at the hospital, and there was this adoption case, a baby boy who had been left behind. He looked so perfect, so much like what I imagined our son would have been." He paused, his voice breaking. I couldn't bear to tell you the truth, that our baby was gone. So I made a decision. I adopted Eden without telling you. I thought I was doing the right thing." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. "You lied to me. You took someone else's child and pretended he was ours." "No," George said desperately. "Not someone else's child. Our child. I've loved him as if he were my own from the moment I saw him. He is ours, Sarah, in every way that matters." Tears streamed down Sarah's face, her chest heaving with the weight of her emotions. "But he isn't ours, George. You stole him from his family, and now he's found his brother and you've robbed them of years they should have had together." George shook his head, his own eyes glistening with tears. "I didn't know about Mike. I swear, I didn't. The adoption agency never told me he had a twin. If I'd known," and his voice faltered, "I would have done things differently. But Sarah, please believe me. I did it for you, for us." Sarah rose abruptly, pacing the room as she tried to process everything. Her mind raced with memories of Eden's childhood, every milestone, every moment of joy. He was her son. Of that she was certain. But the revelation of his origins, of the brother he had been separated from, tore at her heart. "I don't know how to forgive this, George," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You lied to me. You lied to Eden, and you kept Mike from him. How can I ever trust you again?" George's face crumpled and he sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know if you can, but I swear, Sarah, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. No more secrets, no more lies." That night, Sarah sat by Eden's bed, watching him sleep. His small chest rose and fell with each breath, his face peaceful in the soft glow of the nightlight. Her heart ached with the depth of her love for him, a love that had only grown stronger in the wake of George's confession. "He's my son," she whispered to herself. "Not because of biology, but because I've loved him every single day of his life." Yet, she couldn't shake the thought of Mike, the boy who shared Eden's face, his laughter, his very essence. They had been born together, connected in ways she couldn't fully understand, and then torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. They deserved to know each other, to have the bond they had been denied for so long. The next morning, Sarah called Clara. "We need to talk," she said. "I have something to tell you." When Sarah arrived at Clara's house later that day, she was greeted with a look of cautious hope. They sat down in the living room, and Sarah took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Clara," she began, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. "The DNA test confirmed it. Eden and Mike are twins." Clara's breath hitched, her eyes filling with tears. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew there was something special about them." Sarah nodded, her own tears threatening to spill over. "But there's more. I need to tell you the truth about Eden's adoption." She recounted George's confession, her words heavy with regret and sorrow. Clara listened in stunned silence, her face a mixture of shock and understanding. When Sarah finished, she reached across the table, taking Sarah's hands in hers. "I can't imagine how hard this must be for you," Clara said softly. "But I'm glad you told me, and I'm glad our boys have found each other." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the truth settling between them. Finally, Clara spoke again. "What do we do now?" Sarah smiled through her tears. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and Clara worked together to foster the bond between Eden and Mike. Playdates turned into sleepovers, and soon the boys were inseparable, their laughter filling the spaces where pain and secrets once lingered. Watching them together, Sarah felt a bittersweet joy, grateful for their connection, but mourning the years they had lost. George, too, began to take steps toward redemption. He apologized to Sarah, to Eden, and even to Clara, his remorse genuine and profound. Though the road to forgiveness was long, he was determined to walk it, one step at a time. One evening, as the two families gathered for dinner, Sarah looked around the table, the boys giggling over a shared joke, Clara and George exchanging tentative smiles, and felt a flicker of hope. Their journey had been fraught with pain and betrayal, but it had also brought them closer in ways she never could have imagined. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the room, Sarah reached for George's hand. "This is our chance to heal," she said softly, "to give Eden and Mike the relationship they deserve." George squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right, no more secrets." And in that moment, surrounded by the laughter of their children and the promise of a new beginning, Sarah knew that they would find their way forward. Together, the days following the emotional dinner brought an odd calm to Sarah's life, a kind of fragile peace that she feared might shatter at any moment. The truth was out in the open, yet the raw wounds left by the revelation still lingered, tender to the touch. For Sarah, it wasn't just about grappling with the fact that Eden had a twin. It was about the trust that had been fractured between her and George. George had begun to change. He was quieter now, more introspective. His once brisk, assured demeanor was softened by a guilt that seemed to weigh on him constantly. He made deliberate efforts to help Sarah, taking on small tasks he'd once overlooked, like folding the laundry or picking Eden up from school. But no matter how many steps forward he took, Sarah couldn't ignore the distance between them. It wasn't malicious or cold. It was the kind of distance that grew from unspoken pain. One evening, as Sarah found herself sitting in the living room, sorting through a pile of Eden's old baby clothes, each tiny outfit brought back memories. The time he had taken his first steps, the feverish nights she had spent rocking him to sleep, his first Halloween costume. Her love for him was a deep, unshakable truth. Yet now, it was intertwined with a gnawing ache for what had been hidden from her. George entered the room quietly, hesitant, as though afraid of disturbing her thoughts. "Can I help?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah glanced up, her hands pausing over a tiny pair of overalls. She studied his face, worn and weary, yet earnest. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her tone void of accusation but heavy with curiosity. George sat down across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I regret the lies," he said after a long pause. "I regret not telling you the truth from the start. But adopting Eden? No, not for a second. He saved us, Sarah. When we lost our baby, I thought I'd lose you too. And then I saw Eden, and it felt like fate." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "You should have trusted me, George. Trusted that I could handle the truth, even if it hurt." "I know," George whispered, "and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you'll let me." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a flicker of warmth toward him, a fragile thread of connection. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," she admitted, "but I want to try. For Eden. For us." George nodded, his relief palpable. "That's all I can ask for." Meanwhile, Eden and Mike were thriving in each other's company. Their bond seemed effortless, as though the years they had spent apart melted away in the shared moments of laughter and play. Clara often brought Mike over for weekend visits, and the boys would disappear into their world of forts, soccer games, and whispered secrets. One Saturday afternoon, Sarah watched them from the kitchen window as they kicked a ball back and forth in the backyard. Their identical features glowed in the sunlight, their laughter ringing out like music. Clara stood beside her, holding a mug of tea. So they look so happy," Clara said softly. "They do," Sarah agreed. She hesitated, then added, "Thank you for letting this happen, for being open to all of it." Clara smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "They're brothers. They deserve this, no matter how messy the road to get here has been." Sarah turned to her, studying the woman who had become an unexpected ally. "How are you handling all of this? Really?" Clara sighed, setting her mug down on the counter. "It's been a lot. Knowing Mike has a twin, and that I didn't know for so long. It's hard not to feel like I failed him somehow, but then I remind myself that he's happy, he's loved, and now he has more family than I ever imagined for him." Her words struck a chord in Sarah. She reached out, placing a hand on Clara's arm. "You didn't fail him. You gave him a beautiful life, and now we'll give him and Eden something even better, together." The two families began spending more time together, their lives slowly weaving into a patchwork of shared moments and tentative healing. Birthdays were celebrated jointly, and holidays became occasions filled with a blend of new traditions and old memories. Clara and Sarah grew closer, their shared commitment to the boys forming a bond that felt as though it had always been there. Eden and Mike's relationship blossomed in ways that surprised even them. They finished each other's sentences, shared inside jokes, and instinctively understood one another in a way that only twins could. But their connection wasn't without its complexities. One evening, as Sarah was tucking Eden into bed, he looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Mom," he asked, Why didn't we know about Mike before? The question caught Sarah off guard. She sat on the edge of his bed, smoothing the blanket over his chest. That's a hard question to answer, sweetheart, she said gently. Sometimes adults make choices they think are best, even if those choices end up being wrong. Eden frowned, his small brows knitting together. Was it a bad choice? It was a mistake, Sarah admitted. But now we know the truth, and we're trying to make things right. That's what matters. Eden seemed to consider this, his face thoughtful. I'm glad I have Mike, he said finally. It feels like I've always known him. Sarah leaned down, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Me too, baby. Me too. As time passed, the initial sting of betrayal softened, though it never fully disappeared. Sarah found herself reevaluating what family meant, what love and forgiveness required. George continued to work to regain her trust, his actions speaking louder than his words ever could. He showed up for Sarah, for Eden, for the new extended family they were creating. One evening, as the families gathered for dinner at Clara's house, George stood to address the room. I want to say something, he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. All eyes turned to him. I've made a lot of mistakes, he continued, and I've hurt people I care about. But standing here, seeing these boys together, seeing all of us together, I realize how lucky I am. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm grateful for the chance to try and earn it. Thank you, all of you, for letting me be part of this. His words hung in the air, raw and sincere. Sarah reached for his hand under the table, her grip firm. It wasn't a grand gesture of reconciliation, but it was a step. A small, hopeful step toward healing. That night, as the boys fell asleep on the living room floor, curled up under a shared blanket, Sarah and Clara sat together, watching them. The glow of the fireplace bathed the room in warm light, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance with the quiet hum of contentment. They're going to be okay, Clara said softly, breaking the silence. Sarah nodded, her heart full. We all will. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah felt a sense of peace. The road they had traveled had been fraught with pain and uncertainty, but it had led them here, to a place of connection, of understanding, of love. And as the fire crackled softly, Sarah allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a brighter tomorrow. Together, they would rebuild what had been broken, one moment at a time. Together, they would create something stronger, something whole. The morning light filtered through the curtains of Sarah's home, casting golden streaks on the walls. A quiet calm settled over the house as Eden and Mike played in the backyard, their laughter floating in through the open kitchen window. Sarah stood at the counter, hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, her gaze fixed on the boys. Their bond had deepened over the past few months, transforming from a novelty into something natural, unbreakable. They were no longer strangers navigating their similarities, they were brothers in every sense of the word. Clara's car pulled into the driveway and Sarah stepped outside to greet her. Clara exited with a warm smile, holding a dish covered in foil. Morning, Clara said, handing the dish to Sarah. Thought I'd bring over my famous lasagna since the boys seem to eat us out of house and home every weekend. Sarah laughed, lifting the foil to peek at the layers of pasta and sauce. You're a lifesaver. They're already asking what's for lunch. Clara's gaze drifted to the boys, her smile softening. They've really settled into this, haven't they? Like they've always been together. Sarah nodded. It's amazing to watch, but more than that, it's healing for all of us. Clara turned to Sarah, her expression growing more serious. And you? How are you doing with everything? With George? Sarah exhaled deeply, leaning against the doorframe. It's been complicated. I won't lie, there are still moments where I feel the weight of what he did. But he's trying, Clara. Really trying, and I see it not just in how he treats me, but in how he's stepped up for Eden, for Mike even. Clara reached out, squeezing Sarah's arm. You're stronger than you think, and whatever happens, the boys will always have us. Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. Clara had become more than a fellow mother in this strange journey. They were partners, allies in navigating a path neither had expected, but both were committed to. As summer approached, the families decided to plan a joint vacation, a chance to create new memories and continue building the bridge between their lives. After much deliberation and endless lobbying from the boys, they settled on a beach trip. The idea of sun-soaked days and nights filled with laughter appealed to everyone, offering a much-needed escape from the emotional roller coaster of the past months. The beach house they rented was nestled along a quiet stretch of coastline, its wrap-around porch overlooking the endless expanse of ocean. The first evening was spent unpacking, settling into rooms, and preparing a casual dinner of grilled fish and fresh salads. The boys raced along the shoreline, their footprints crisscrossing in the wet sand as they chased each other with wild abandon. George, standing on the porch with a drink in hand, watched them with a wistful smile. Sarah joined him, a soft breeze tugging at her hair. "They're happy," George said, his voice low. "They are," Sarah agreed, leaning on the railing beside him, "and they deserve to be." George turned to her, his expression earnest. "Sarah, I know I've said it before, but I need you to know how sorry I am, for all of it, for the lies, for the pain I caused. I know I can't undo it, but I'm trying to be better, for you, for Eden." Sarah looked at him, her emotions a swirl of lingering hurt and cautious hope. "You've come a long way, George, but trust isn't something you rebuild overnight. It takes time." "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "I'll wait as long as it takes." Their conversation was interrupted by the boys calling them down to the beach, their voices filled with excitement over the sandcastle they were building. Sarah glanced at George, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of the partnership they once had. Perhaps, she thought, healing wasn't so far out of reach after all. The beach trip proved to be transformative. Mornings were spent collecting seashells and exploring tide pools, afternoons filled with swimming in sandcastles, and evenings reserved for bonfires under the stars. The boys thrived in the freedom of the outdoors, their bond growing even stronger with each shared adventure. One night, as the families gathered around the fire, Eden and Mike hatched a plan to host a talent show for the adults. Their enthusiasm was contagious, and soon everyone was roped into participating. George reluctantly agreed to play his old guitar, while Clara performed a comedic monologue that had everyone in stitches. Sarah surprised them all with a soulful rendition of an old folk song, her voice carrying a bittersweet beauty that left the group momentarily silent. When it was Eden and Mike's turn, they stood proudly before their audience, announcing they had prepared a skit. The performance was chaotic and hilarious, filled with exaggerated voices and playful jabs at their parents. By the end, everyone was doubled over with laughter, tears streaming down their cheeks. As the fire died down, Sarah looked around at the people who had become her family. George, Clara, the boys. The darkness of the past months hadn't disappeared, but in its place there was light, there was laughter, there was love. Returning home after the trip, life resumed with a newfound sense of normalcy. Eden and Mike split their time between houses, their lives becoming a seamless blend of two families. Clara and Sarah grew closer, often meeting for coffee or walking the boys to school together. Even George, once a distant figure in Clara's life, found ways to connect with her, his efforts to make amends extending beyond Sarah and Eden. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. One evening, as Sarah was helping Eden with his homework, he hesitated, his pencil hovering over the page. "Mom, he said softly. "Do you ever think Mike missed me?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She set down the papers she was sorting and knelt beside him. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Well," Eden said, fidgeting with the edge of his notebook, "if we're twins, does that mean he knew I was missing? Like, in his heart?" Tears pricked Sarah's eyes at the innocence of his question. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. "I think," she said carefully, "that sometimes people can feel a connection even when they don't know where it comes from. And now that you've found each other, that connection can only grow stronger." Eden nodded, seeming comforted by her words. But as he returned to his homework, Sarah couldn't help but wonder the same thing. Had Mike felt the absence of his brother all those years? Had Eden? And what would their futures hold now that they were finally reunited? Months turned into a year, and the family settled into a rhythm that felt almost effortless. Birthdays were celebrated with joint parties, and holidays became shared affairs filled with laughter and togetherness. The past wasn't forgotten, but it no longer loomed over them like a shadow. Instead, it became a testament to their resilience, a reminder of how far they had come. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves turned brilliant shades of red and gold, the families gathered at the park for a picnic. The boys raced ahead, their laughter echoing through the trees. George and Clara set up the blanket while Sarah unpacked the food. As they sat together, passing sandwiches and swapping stories, Clara turned to Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "I never thought I'd find myself in this kind of situation. But I'm glad I did. I'm glad we all found each other." If you find it interesting, please comment with the number 2. If it's not engaging, press 1 so we can improve the content and make it even better. Sarah smiled, her heart full. "Me too. It's not the life I expected, but maybe it's the one we were meant to have." George, overhearing their exchange, nodded. "Sometimes the hardest paths lead to the best places." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the families packed up and headed home. Sarah lingered for a moment, watching Eden and Mike walk ahead, their identical silhouettes framed by the fading light. In their bond, she saw a promise, a future filled with love, connection, and the strength of a family that had weathered the storm together. Life, Sarah realized, wasn't perfect. It was messy and unpredictable, filled with mistakes and pain. But it was also beautiful, rich with moments of joy, and the kind of love that could heal even the deepest wounds. And as she walked toward her family, she felt a quiet certainty. They would be okay. Together they would always find their way.